Hello. So today we are going to explore the fundamentals of botany. Botany, of course, being the study of plants and plant anatomy. So this is going to be extraordinarily helpful when you are writing your eventual monograph project for this class. And it's also a good refresher from either your biology classes, or maybe you had the fortune of taking a botany class either in college or in high school. So this should give us a good overview of different parts of plants, how to correctly categorize them, and then also highlights from certain plants which use a specific uh, area of plant anatomy for their therapeutic effect. So let's get started. So what is botany? Well, broadly, botany is the scientific study of plants, including their physiology, structure, genetics, ecology, distribution, classification, and economic importance. So it's a very multifaceted study. We're not just talking about plant anatomy. We're not just talking about classifying, oh, this plant is a flower, this plant is a bush. No, it's much more nuanced and physiologically and scientifically rigorous than just that. But in this lecture, we're going to have just a fundamental view of botany. So we'll be focusing on botanical definitions, classifications, and plant anatomy. Now, this is a fundamental area which should help you get through the rest of the course. So, plant anatomy is often classified either in English or in Latin. And we're going to go through each of these parts and major natural products which utilize each of these individual parts of a plant for isolating and making that specific secondary metabolite into a medication. So the aerial parts, basically any part of the plant or herb that is above the ground, is known as the herb, the aerial parts of the plants, otherwise known as herba in Latin. You'll see these used interchangeably in botanical text, so that's why I like to teach you both the English and the Latin version. For leaf, we have folia, easy to remember, right? Because foliage, especially up in New England where I'm at, where we have wonderful foliage and fall colors in the autumn, we have leaf or folia, foliage. Flower is flos, fruit is fructus, bark is cortex, root is radix, rhizome is rhizoma. We're going to go over the difference, by the way, between a root and a rhizome and what makes each different. Likewise with a bulb, bulbous. And seeds, of course, are semen. Makes sense as well, right? Because we're talking about the reproductive portion of the plant. Let's start off with herba, herb, the aerial parts of the plant. So it's literally everything you see above ground, from the stem to the leaves to any sort of flowers that might be present. That is the herba. The botanical synonym is also herbaceous plant. So sometimes you'll see plants listed as herbaceous. That just means they have sort of a an herby type of stem. They don't have like bark or anything like that. They don't. It's not like a bush or something that has or twigs or that sort of thing. If it's completely herbaceous, if it's green and flexible, much like a basal plant. Of course, herbs vary greatly in size, and we also have an interesting conundrum within the botanical community and the botanical uh, selling and marketplace as a whole. Oftentimes, you will see extracts that are standardized to one specific ingredient. So, for instance, broadly, I could say for green tea, in green tea, they're going to standardize that extract to a compound called EGCG, or epigallocatechin gallate, right? EGCG for short. Definitely rolls off the tongue a bit better, right? However, there's a ton of different catechins and other medicinal or potentially therapeutically beneficial products within tea, whether it's antioxidants, whether it's even caffeine, maybe for focus. So you can standardize supplements based on an extraction of just one part of the plant. You're just extracting the EGCG, for instance. Or you can take the whole plant, the whole herba, the whole herb, and extract everything. You sort of blend it up and then take a whole extraction. And that leads to a belief called synergism, because you're not just getting the one compound, then you're getting everything within the plant. And those individual compounds within the plant, as they are interacting with each other, metabolically within themselves, as well as metabolically rather, within your own body, they can cause what's a synergistic effect. It means that they sort of help each other and enhance each other's effects, whether it's through inducing SIPs, whether it's through chemical interactions, which create more favorable conditions for bioavailability or for the drug to be metabolized better within the body. There's many compelling arguments with many herbs that the sum of the whole may be greater, in fact, than the sum of its parts. That is to say that maybe we want to lean more towards whole herb extracts rather than just standardized extracts of a specific part of the plant to a specific compound. We'll get into this a lot later, but just something to keep in mind when we're talking about the standardization of certain medications. One plant that is used in its entirety, partially because it's so small, is thyme or Thymus vulgaris. So it's a good example of a cure-all plant where all of the aerial parts of the herb, all of the herba, are used in some way. So that includes the stem, the flowers, the leaves, and why is that? Well, because the active constituent is present in all of those areas. The active constituent being, among others, thymol. Thymol is a monoterpenoid phenol that has antiseptic properties when extracted and standardized to around a 30% solution, based on what we know from trials. And of course, orally, you might cut up thyme and put it as seasoning for a number of things. It's very common in the culinary spaces. It's also used in herbal cough syrup for pertussis, bronchitis, asthma, other respiratory disorders. Why? Because it's very, very commonly used as an aromatic terpenoid. Anything that has a terpene, so you see it's a monoterpenoid phenol right there, that basically means that it lends itself to being it lends itself very much so to being an essential oil or something that would be beneficial in aromatherapy because aromatic terpenoids, they freely diffuse into the air, and that's what gives thyme its specific smell. Same thing when we think of peppermint. Same thing when we think of certain strains of cannabis as well. Very, very terpenoid focused, and you're going to get strong smells coming from herbs that have that. Anyway, thyme is also used traditionally, at least, as a diuretic, a anti-diarrheal, could be even used for bedwetting, flatulence. Topically, as again with those the aromatic properties, it could be good for laryngitis, halitosis. It's even used with chlorhexidine rinse to prevent cavities. It's a weak antibacterial rather, and antifungal. And cosmetically, of course, you see it everywhere, whether it's Bath and Body Works or you see it in potpourri or various perfumes, essential oils, especially for respiratory distress and relaxation. So that's an example of a plant which is fully used from the stem just about down to the roots as an extract for multiple different potential therapeutic uses. All right, next we have folia, leaves. So they appear on both deciduous and coniferous plants. Deciduous, of course, being simple leaves with multiple veins. It's what you think of when you see a standard kind of leaf. Coniferous plants, those are usually trees, but they don't have to be. They're needle or scale-like with one vein. So those are our like pine trees and things like that. Those are coniferous plants. Leaves provide an essential function to a lot of most plants. They are the main source of photosynthesis, providing food for all green plants. They store chemical energy, starches, and water, so they're also storage containers essentially for the nutrients of the plant. They also obtain carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the stomata, which are microscopic pores that you can sometimes see with your naked eye, usually on the bottom of the leaves. And that's how they take in and they perform photosynthesis and they convert that carbon dioxide into oxygen. Now, a botanical classification of how leaves are arranged is actually has its own term and terminology when you're describing a plant. So, phyllotaxis is the botanical term for the arrangement of leaves on a plant stem. So it's very, very useful in identifying plants, especially when plants otherwise have the same shape of leaves or they might look very similar to each other. This is a way to distinguish from otherwise very similar looking plant species. So there's three main arrangements for deciduous plants that have phyllotaxis. So we have listed 1, 2, and 3 right here. So 1 is opposite. So you see there's 2 leaves coming out of the same area of the stem, but they're on opposite sides of the stem. We have alternate or spiral sometimes, which is, sort of alternates left then right, left then right, left then right, so on and so forth down the stem. And then we have whorled, which is the leaves sort of grow off in little sections, not directly off of the stem, but they grow sort of together in different areas. So, for example, and this is a very good plant to know how to identify using phyllotaxis, this is poison ivy. What type of phyllotaxis would I use to describe poison ivy? Well, it's certainly deciduous. You can see that it's not needles or anything. And it is whorled, right? Because it has those little areas leading off at the stem that have, what do we know from the old rhyme? Leaves of three, let it be, right? Or leave it be. An example of a natural product, which is most known for using its leaves, would be senna or Senna spp. I'll note that the Latin name for senna has spp. That just stands for sort of a generic placeholder for species because there are lots of different species of senna, and just about all of them are used usually in mixtures for its perceived medicinal quality, which in this case is a laxative. Senicide or senoglycoside obtained from the leaves is the active ingredient in many over-the-counter stimulant laxatives. So these stimulant laxatives, senna specifically, but other ones too, stimulate the GI tract by sort of irritating it. And it's especially useful for opiate-induced constipation. So if someone is on chronic opioid or opiate medications, they may be prescribed senna for use so they can uh, have regular bowel movements as opposed to having chronic constipation, which is typical for long-term opiate use. Again, as I mentioned, they act as irritants within the GI wall to increase colonic motility and fluid secretion. However, they are not for chronic use. There is a risk of dependency with senna, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're constantly irritating your GI tract, your body's eventually going to adapt. So realistically, senna is only great to use PRN or as needed because you're not going to want to use it chronically or else you may become dependent upon it in order to go to the bathroom at all. Its dosage forms are either oral, so tablets or liquid teas. You might have heard of X-Lax or Senecot. Those are the top, the usual brand names. And then, of course, it can also be used as suppositories. Always an important, an important thing about suppositories. If you do use a suppository or an enema, you better be using it on the toilet, as opposed to the oral dosage forms, which might take a little bit to work through your system. Suppositories, that's the exact area of onset of action, and you're sort of cutting out the middleman of having to swallow a tablet. So always counsel a patient to be in the bathroom if they're using a suppository. Flower, the reproductive structure in flowering plants. So we're going to break down the basics of flower anatomy here, starting with the sepals. So the sepals right here, otherwise known as the calyx, the sepals are small leaf-like parts which protect the flower before it blossoms. So when the sepals are closed, you would often call that like a flower bud, right? And then those little protective leaves will open up, and then the flower will blossom. So that comes from the sepals. The petals are meant to attract pollinators. So many times the petals actually have, we were talking in the previous lecture about secondary metabolites and how they might be used to attract pollinators or to further propagate the plant species, giving it a competitive advantage. Well, there's a reason why flowers smell really good, and some of that smell is generated within the petals and within the flower itself. And also, even from just a color perspective, many times, because bees, if you can believe it, actually can see sort of into the ultraviolet spectrum. There's actually a color called bee yellow, which which when viewed through an ultraviolet lens, you can kind of see it's almost like little runways directing the bees exactly where to go in certain flowers that we can't see with our naked eye because we can only see in visual light. But from UV light, flowers are even more colorful for some species. So these petals are served to attract pollinators and also protect, to a lesser extent, the reproductive organs of the flower. What are those organs, you might ask? Well, we have the pistil, which is right here in the center. It's the female organ, and it contains the ovules or egg cells, which will eventually grow into seeds after they are pollinated. Now, the pistil is sometimes, but not always, accompanied by the stamen. Stamen are the male organ of the flowering plant, which produces pollen. So those are transported to the pistil by the pollinators. So oftentimes, a flower, we will land on this flower. it'll collect a bunch of pollen onto its while landing into the flower to drink the nectar. And that pollen will inevitably rub off on the pistil, thereby fertilizing the ovules, the seed cells within the flower. Once the flower dies, it'll eventually release those seeds, so the plant itself can continue to propagate. I would mention too, there are sometimes species of plants which are considered male or female. Uh, Pear trees, certain types of apple trees are good examples of this. Pear trees often need to be paired with a male of the species and a female of the species in order to fruit and make pears, because those flowers mainly, the male would only have stamen, the female would only have pistils, or the female. So it takes a little bit more steps in order for pollination. We don't just have auto-pollinating for hermaphroditic or plants with both boy and girl parts within the flower. That is not to say that it's impossible. This might be a little bit more difficult to propagate. So what's probably the most famous flower used in medicine? I'd probably say it was chamomile or Matricaria chamomilla. So there's multiple active constituent polyphenols, as we call, and terpenes. Remember those aromatic compounds? And they're found in the flower head and the petals. So chamomile, you've most likely heard it in the context of chamomile tea or in herbal teas, which are made using the dried flowers and hot water. Now, it's notable among tea species because when we think of green tea, what do we think of? Tea leaves. You're reading the tea leaves in the bottom of the cup to determine your fortune, right? Well, in the case of chamomile, it would be flowers. So chamomile tea is a normally used as a sleep aid for insomnia, and it's a nice form of tea because unlike green tea, which naturally has caffeine, chamomile has nothing of the sort. It is good for insomnia because it doesn't have any caffeine and it still provides that sort of warm beverage and relaxation before bed. It has some anti-anxiety or anxiolytic properties, breaking up anxiety. And there's also some evidence for treating dyspepsia and diarrhea as well. Now, it's used as a topical cream as well, and essential oils. It actually helps as an astringent for hemorrhoids. And of course, aromatherapy for sleep and anxiety. Again, it kind of, if I had to classify chamomile as being a part of any one thing or any one classification or order of natural product, I would say it sort of falls into the anti-anxiety and sleep aid camp. However, we have to be cautious about some certain contraindications. So namely, it is a flower and it has a lot of pollen. So if you have a pollen or a ragweed allergy, it's generally considered prudent to avoid any sort of chamomile product because obviously you don't want to exacerbate trying to fall asleep with a potential allergic reaction. It also must be very carefully used or not used at all, actually. It's completely contraindicated in pregnancy because it may induce contractions. In fact, in some native tribes, it was even used as an abortifacient, so as a form of birth control, even in some Native American traditions, when they uh, did not want to, they wanted to essentially to have family planning, even back then in indigenous times before European contact. So cannot use in pregnancy. Caution with pollen or ragweed allergies. However, I would say like I have a pollen allergy. I love some good chamomile tea. So there's not always that cross sensitivity. Fruits or fructus, seed-bearing structure in flowering plants, which have two functions. Number one function for fruit, it protects the seeds. That's self-explanatory, right? The seeds are protected within the fruit so that they can eventually fall off. They get a nice little fertilization and they can propagate elsewhere. They also assist in seed dispersal. If you're not going to wait for the fruit to fall off, those seeds better survive the digestive tract of any animal which might eat the fruit. Then, when the animal eventually goes to the bathroom somewhere else in the woods, those seeds are automatically fertilized, and we get a new berry bush growing somewhere else. They are formed in the ovary, the pistil, after blossoming. And agriculturally, in medicinal plants which bear fruit are selectively bred to promote certain desirable traits. So we might breed these in order to make more phytochemicals, greater concentrations of them, a greater ratio of flesh versus seed, because obviously you want the juiciest, fleshiest fruit as opposed to something that has a big pit. Aesthetically, we breed them for color, for shape, for texture, to make it more palatable. And of course, hardiness in different climates. So, like I mentioned with secondary metabolites in the previous lecture, occasionally we're going to have areas of the country which are maybe less hospitable. So if you want to maybe grow oranges a bit farther north than Florida, maybe you're going to crossbreed them with more northernly breeds in order to get a little bit more of that natural antifreeze or that natural cold hardiness natural product, which is inherently produced as a secondary metabolite to provide a competitive advantage. So hardiness in different climates might lead to selective breeding, so we can better propagate and better farm these different fruits in many different areas. Here's a great example of what we would call selective breeding. So this is a peach. This is a peach from as it would look at about 4000 BC. The description of the taste, it tastes earthy, sweet, sour, slightly salty. It doesn't look all that appetizing, does it? About 64% of it is edible flesh, has waxy skin. It's not like the peach with like the peach fuzz that we're used to today. And it's about 36% stone, so inedible stone that you're not going to be able to do anything with. And it's tiny, it's 25 millimeters. Cut two, after millennia of selective breeding. So this is the same peach species as this. Both of these species are the same thing. These are the same peach. It's just over years and years of selective breeding have we gone from the traditional, might I say, heirloom peach to the artificial peach of as of its graphic when it was made of 2014. So we went from 64% edible to 90% edible flesh, and that's a 3.6 times reduction in relative stone size. So the stone is only 10% of the peach. It's sweet, refreshing, it's juicy. It's 64 times larger by volume than the previous peach, and it has soft, edible skin as opposed to that waxy skin. But again, this is the same species. It's only through years and millennia, thousands and thousands of years of selective breeding and domestication of this peach species. Now we can still I've gotten this question before. We can still find natural peaches like this in the wild. They're not grown, obviously. They're not commonly grown, and there's not as many of them. But in certain areas of the world, you can still find what would be considered a natural peach that has not been touched by the years and years and years of human intervention. But again, it's the same species then as it is today. Great other example of a fruit, pineapple, Ananas camosus. If you speak Spanish, it's very, very easy to remember pineapple because anana is pineapple in Spanish. Anyway, tropical or ananao as well in French, actually, I believe. Anyway, tropical fruit native to South America with a large edible fruit. We all know what a pineapple looks like. Has multiple phytochemicals, the most notable of which is bromelain, which is a proteolytic enzyme, meaning it breaks down protein naturally. So what did we figure out? Or rather, what did the native people of the Caribbean and South America figure out? Well, it's a perfect meat tenderizer. They didn't know exactly how it works. Obviously, they didn't know that it was bromelain and it was proteolytic or whatever, but they knew that if they soaked their steak, their beef in a pineapple juice, their chicken, it tenderized the meat. It made it more tasty. It made it more palatable, more tender. And it's also used as a digestive aid for that same reason, because it helps sort of digest the meat. Um, it's also quite effective as an anti-inflammatory for acute postoperative and post-traumatic conditions of swelling and pain. Namely, this has been explored overseas in the European Union. It's been explored and actually approved in the European Union as a topical gel from bromelain concentrate from the fruit of the pineapple itself for the debridement of severe burns in the need of a skin transplant. So that same idea that bromelain is sort of breaks up proteolyses the proteins and different tissues, it's really, really good for debridement. So it removes ester or scabs from burns during debridement. Debridement, of course, it's a very painful process where the dead skin has to be cleared off pretty regularly for a burn patient so the good skin underneath it can heal. And it's great because the bromelain actually it disintegrates the old burned dead skin while not harming the surrounding healthy tissue. So it actually eliminates the need for what is often quite painful and imprecise surgical debridement and actually is found to decrease healing times. So as of now, phase 3 trials, so those final phase of drug trials for bromelain are underway in the US. and we're looking to get it approved. But Nexobride is the name of it. I think it's a really, really interesting natural product, which is soon to become a prescription medication, and we'll see where that goes. Root or radix, all right? Uh, botanical our next botanical part on our journey. So, and of course, I had to include the hottest band in late night, The Roots. If you haven't listened to some of their solo stuff, check it out. Anyway, roots have multiple functions. Their primary function, of course, we would think of is providing structural support, which anchors the aerial parts of the plant. So it goes without saying that you need a strong root system in order for a plant to grow, in order for it to grow tall and not flop over. Roots, of course, also absorb water and nutrients, providing primary metabolism for the plant. Now, secondarily, roots are also used in the storage of water and nutrients. They're used for vegetative reproduction. So when we think of asexual reproduction or cuttings from plants, and we split a plant up and we or split the root, oftentimes that is quite useful in the propagation of plants via cuttings and also competition with other plants. You'll recall from the previous lecture, I talked about the walnut tree and how through its root system, it secretes sort of poisons to eliminate the competition, as it were, in and around the tree so it can grow up nice and strong and tall. Sometimes roots will essentially choke out their neighbors via poison or otherwise in order to ensure that it gains a competitive advantage in what is oftentimes a very competitive environment. There's two types of roots to focus on. We have fibrous root systems, that's A right here. They're thin, they have moderately branching roots. And then we also have the taproot. Taproots are large, central, and dominant roots. They're most common in trees and root vegetables. So when I think of a taproot, the typical example would be a carrot. Big, thick root with maybe some little fibers sticking out from under it. Most root vegetables are taproots. When I think of fibrous root systems, a lot of times I would think of cactus or grass even. If you've ever seen sod and you've seen like sod being like laid down or something, and you can look at the roots, those are fibrous roots that are natural within those grasses. Now, roots are usually below the surface of the soil, but they may also be aerial or above ground roots in some plants. We still call them roots, even if they are aerial, because they're serving that same purpose of either providing structural support or storage, or you name it. Our most famous uh, natural product that has to do with roots is probably Valeriana officinalis, named, of course, by Linnaeus, denoted by that L with a dot, and it's valerian root. So it's an herbaceous and very odorous perennial with pink flowers. It's native to Europe. The flowers smell sweet. However, the roots have a pungent odor. They're often compared to sweaty socks. So it is not the most pleasant of natural products to have to deal with. Valerian roots have been used for millennia. That's Hippocrates, the father of modern Western medicine, to Galen, who basically created the galenic compounding or the compounding non-sterilely that we use today. Valerian root is known for its sedative effect. So it's yellow brownish, it's very smelly. The root oil is extracted and used for its therapeutic and anti-anxiety effects. So modern day oral supplements can claim to relieve mild anxiety and act as sleep aids, but the exact mechanism of how this works is unknown. We have an idea. We know that valerianic acid, which is naturally secreted and produced within the roots, is a partial serotonin receptor agonist. So it plays a role in your circadian rhythm or your sleep-wake cycle and mood. So this could make a little bit of sense because if someone's having trouble falling asleep and maybe they're anxious during the day, triggering some of those serotonin receptors in order to sort of rewire the brain into a more common circadian rhythm could certainly help reduce anxiety and would certainly give someone a better night's sleep. So you'll often see valerian in combination with other things as either anxiety or sleep supplementation. And those things are standardized, usually to valerianic acid, all of which are mostly gathered from pressings and extracts from the roots. Rhizomes or rhizoma. Now, these are different from roots because they're basically modified plant stems. Even though they kind of look like roots or like a tuber or something like that, they're just roots that grow horizontally instead of vertically, like a stem, right? So they're stems that grow horizontally instead of vertically, if you want to put it that way. They maintain the ability to grow new buds, leaves, and stems even when split apart. So if I wanted to, you can see there's like two buds here. If I wanted to break this up, and I could break it up and then plant them in two separate pots, I would get two different plantlets, which are basically the same genetically. I would essentially have cloned it because it doesn't matter if they're broken up or not. You're able to break them up and then propagate. Functions, of course, asexual reproduction. It doesn't need to be pollinated or anything. You simply split up the rhizome and plant it in a different place, and it very easily starts growing. And of course, it's very useful in the storage of nutrients, especially starches, proteins. It's useful when a plant goes dormant in the winter or dry season as well, because they have all that storage, sort of like not like a bear eating before hibernation, goes into dormancy, and then it has just enough energy by the end of winter or the end of the dry season to start sprouting again when conditions are favorable. Perhaps our most favorite type of rhizome would be ginger or Zingiber officinale. Probably see these in the grocery store. If you're a fan of sushi or some East Asian food, it's really, really tasty. It's an herbaceous and flowering perennial, which grows its stem from the rhizome. You can see the rhizomes here are growing multiple stems out of the same rhizome. Has a long history in traditional East Asian medicine systems like TCM, which is traditional Chinese medicine, Kampo, and Ayurveda, Kampo being Japanese medicine, Ayurveda being traditional Indian medicine practices. And the rhizome is chock full of active constituents such as zingerone, shogal, and gingerol. All of these have antioxidants. All of them have volatile oils, which give ginger its signature sort of spicy taste and smell. I will say it's always a funny story. The first year I was teaching this course, I brought in a raw ginger, and there was this one kid who was like, "Oh, I love ginger. Can I take a bite out of it?" And I was like, "At your own risk." And poor kid was like coughing for at least another 5 minutes at the end of, towards the end of the class. It was really really tough. So again, pure ginger is not like the stuff you get in the sushi restaurants. Anyway, it's useful, probably most often used as an antiemetic. We think of ginger ale, right? So it's an antiemetic for anti-nausea properties if you're feeling motion sickness, for instance. And it also has some anti-inflammatory properties, but ginger is most often indicated for nausea, especially researched in treating and preventing motion sickness, whether orally as a food or supplement or via aromatherapy. Bulbs or bulbous. Now, bulbs are essentially short stems, which function as food storage organs. So very similar to a rhizome. They are short stems, but they're not considered rhizomes because you can't really split a bulb and it won't still propagate like a rhizome would. However, they're seen as sort of the resting stage of some seed plants. So I would think a lot of times of tulips, right? So tulips often grow quite well in the early spring, and they grow from bulbs. The environmental conditions trigger the activity of or dormancy of the bulbs. So again, when the weather is nice and the winter is over, the bulbs will start growing, and you'll see the tulips start to form as the weather gets a bit warmer. Bulbs also serve the purpose of conserving energy and allow the plant to live through adverse conditions. So they store sugars, they store starches, all of those primary metabolites for later use. And there's multiple uses in folk medicine and cuisine, in addition to cultural significance. If you want a really cool Google, like Wikipedia rabbit hole, Google tulip mania. That's a big craze in Holland and the Netherlands, among the Dutch and throughout Europe in the early, I want to say 1500s, 1400s. So definitely check that out if you want some extra culture for the day. But anyway, probably our favorite bulb is garlic, Allium sativum. Garlic bulbs, they're also called cloves. They contain multiple active constituents, some of which contribute to garlic's distinct odor. Mainly, those are organosulfur compounds responsible for the smell. So they're allicin and allicin. Allicin is broken into allicin, and as a metabolite, it's broken in when it reaches into your body and your body starts metabolizing it. That's where we get garlic breath because it breaks those sulfur bonds, those organosulfur bonds, and what comes out? Garlic breath because those bonds are being broken. We have antioxidants as well. Garlic is chock full of them. Now, they've been cultivated for food and medicine for thousands of years, beginning with the Babylonians rather, and they have great cultural significance, especially in Europe. I always also encourage my students to um, answer the question, why do vampires hate garlic? So if you'd like to email me, feel free. You can tell me why vampires hate garlic. Uh, Very, very interesting cultural phenomenon, especially in Eastern Europe. Check out Transylvania, Romania, Balkan traditions. Very cool. But anyway, today garlic, in addition to being probably a staple of many foods, my favorite Italian foods included, it's generally marketed as a supplement for cardiovascular health. So, garlic has been shown through various trials to be pretty decently effective at lowering blood pressure, cholesterol. It has a lot of antioxidants, and it's also used in many detox supplements as well. Now, is it going to take you out of, is it going to get rid of your high blood pressure if you start eating garlic every single day? No. However, in as an adjunct therapy, as a add-on therapy to say like a statin medication or a beta blocker or amlodipine or something like as other medications which might lower blood pressure or contribute to heart health. It might knock you in, decrease your high blood pressure, for instance, by maybe 4 to 5 points, 4 to 5 millimeters of mercury. Now, will this do a lot? Clinically, no. However, it might knock you down into a lower risk standard in addition to some of these other medications. So it's useful to have garlic potentially as a supplementation if you can just get over the potential odorous effects of uh, continued use of garlic supplementation. Next, we have seeds or semen. These are small embryonic plants encased in the protective seed coat. Now, you'll forgive me, the best diagram I could find was actually in Spanish. So I've translated here, but you can kind of see this is the best way of looking at it. We have the embryonic leaf or the cotyledon. That's down here. The embryonic stem or the epicotyl. That's down here over here, this little sort of orangey part. The embryonic root or the radicle, the radicula there. And we have the endosperm, which is all of this stuff in here within the seed. That's a storage place for nutrition, for oils, the proteins surrounding the embryo, so it has enough food to grow. When it's time to grow, when the conditions are right and the seed leaves its dormancy, you can water the seed and plant it, and it undergoes germination, or the process by which an organism grows from a seed or spore from dormancy. So we see multiple steps of germination. Number one, we moisturize or imbibe the seed, and that sort of triggers the germination to begin. The radicle and the plumule are their seedling start to emerge. Again, it's still underground at this point, but you can see the plumule emerging right there, and the radicle is starting to take shape as the first little roots. The cotyledons will then unfold. Those are our baby leaves, the first ones, and then we eventually establish the new plant, and that is the process of germination. So, for instance, I wanted to highlight the seeds in particular because castor bean is probably most likely most for its seeds. So, castor bean or Ricinus communis, I mentioned it a little bit in the past video as well. It's a fast-growing deciduous shrub with distinctive red-purple coloring in seed pods. Ricinus comes from the Latin word for tick. So when you're looking at this, you can kind of see how the seeds look like ticks, and that's what it was named for. They have this, the seeds of the castor plant, however, they're highly poisonous because they contain ricin, which is one of the most potent poisons really we have on the planet today. A dose of purified ricin powder, the size of just a few grains of table salt, can kill an adult human. So the pulp from about 5 to 20 seeds, which is really scary, and that's why it's used as really a weapon of war, a weapon of mass destruction. When we think of ricin, I think of like MI5 and James Bond and like the CIA and espionage. I mean, that's the type of stuff they use to kill spies. Um, Again, very, very deadly. So it's obviously it evolved as an evolutionary adaptation, so the plant doesn't get eaten, but it is one of the most powerful poisons known, despite it being a very pretty plant. However, the seeds are not oil soluble. They're not lipophilic at all. So ricin isn't oil soluble. So when they crush the seeds into oil and extract the rest of the castor, that's how you make castor oil, which is actually quite safe. It has triglycerides and fatty acid chains used as a laxative in the small intestine. And it's also used as a lubricant in cosmetics and hair care. Castor oil is said to be a secret to healthy hair, healthy and shiny, lustrous hair. Especially back in the day, it was quite popular. All right, here we come to the question of our time: tree anatomy. What are trees? The answer: nobody knows. I wish I was kidding. Nobody knows. To this day, botanists can't agree what trees are. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there's no taxonomic group for trees. So they're classified by their common characteristics, but there's not one thing that makes a tree, making them an example, in fact, of convergent evolution. So there's three types of evolution. So we have divergent evolution, which is probably one of the most common ones, right? So we have a single uh, like father or mother species, right? So A in this case. So it's the same species. And then through time or separation, maybe the continents drifted apart, it eventually, that parent species evolves into two similarly related, but distinctly different species, S and T in this case. We also occasionally have parallel evolution. Parallel evolution, you start with the same species, but maybe they are not necessarily related to each other. Um, and even though by distance they're separated by distance, evolutionarily maybe the conditions are similar, where they each evolved to look very similar to each other. And so that's parallel evolution. Trees are an example of convergent evolution. Convergent evolution being you start with two different types of species. You start with A and T, but they end up looking just like the same species, even though they're not related to each other. Why is this? Well, convergent evolution, trees evolved independently to grow taller to better compete for resources. I say this all the time. Plants can't run away. So what do they have to do? They have to outcompete those around them. What's the best way to do that? When you're struggling for resources in a rainforest, well, you better grow as tall and as quickly as you can so you can get all of that light for photosynthesis. So this is a great example. This is a banana tree. Technically, the banana tree is, I mean, it's as tall as a tree. It can grow to like 30 feet tall. Technically, it's an herb. Technically, the banana is an herb, but it's considered a tree just like a redwood tree is considered a tree, or an oak tree is considered a tree. A banana tree is just as much of a tree as any of those, namely because trees really don't exist. They're completely different genus, they're completely different species and families even. However, because of their height, because of their general woody characteristics, because of their way to outcompete those around them, that's how they're classified as trees. So we say generally, very generally, trees are perennial plants with elongated stems or trunks, and they're oftentimes woody, and they experience both primary and secondary growth, meaning they get both taller and they get thicker as they grow older. That's why we have our tree rings, right? There's two different types, or two main different types of what we would consider to be trees: deciduous versus coniferous. So deciduous trees, those are the trees that shed their leaves annually. The leaves are shed every autumn. They're often turn colors before falling, and they adapt to tolerate cold environments by going dormant in the winter. However, coniferous trees are otherwise known as evergreen trees, and they do not shed their leaves yearly. Their leaves are needle-shaped or they're scale-like. They have cones which contain seeds. Those are our pine cones, and they tolerate cold climates year-round. So, unlike their deciduous counterparts, which can't survive in extraordinarily cold weather, or they go completely dormant when it gets too cold out, the coniferous trees, they have those needles, those adaptations to the cold, so they don't have to shed their needles and they grow well yearly. So what's all that junk inside your trunk, right? What makes a tree a tree? Well, it's generally a trunk. So the trunk is the support structure which stretches upward to give the tree a competitive advantage. It consists of a few different parts. So we have the outer bark, or the cortex, and that insulates the tree from moisture and temperature extremes, and it's continuously renewed. So it's actually it's dead, um, like it's kind of like your skin, right? Like so, it's the skin of the tree, just like your skin. Sort of it sheds dead skin cells as it's replenished over and over again. That's what the outer bark or the cortex of the tree is too, and it's continuously renewed. How is it renewed? Well, it's renewed as the phloem grows outward. The phloem is the inner bark of the tree, and it transports food and nutrients to the other parts of the tree before dying to renew the outer bark. As we travel farther in, we get to the vascular structure of the tree, otherwise known as the xylem. The xylem transports water and water-soluble nutrients, and it's sort of the vascular system that keeps the tree alive. So it's more concentrated towards the center of the trunk rather. And I should mention it's water and water-soluble nutrients. The phloem is more so just food and nutrients. They don't have to be water soluble. So that's about all for our Botany 101 today. We might do Mycology 101 next. We'll see what happens. But if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thank you.